Hello, Fierce Ones, and welcome to the monthly conversation series, The Fierce, Fun, and Fantastic Women Among Us, happening here on the fourth Friday of every month. During these sessions, we spotlight a member of our Fierce Awakened Woman community, and we're talking to leaders and visionaries and wisdom keepers among us so that we can learn about their fierce awakenings and how they're expressing their gifts in the world right now. I'm Jenn Baljko, founder of Always On My Way and the moderator for the Fierce Awakened Woman Facebook group. And today I'm chatting with Sue Ellen May. Hi, Sue.
Hi.
Thanks for saying yes. Welcome. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. Let me tell you a little bit about Sue and then we'll dive into this great conversation. So Sue Ellen May moved from her Maryland home to Alaska 26 years ago. She has been employed as a marketing assistant, a secretary, a preschool teacher, a special education teacher assistant, a naturalist, and a clinical social worker. After retiring, she has had the luxury of time to practice yoga and work as a naturalist with young children and start on her Dharmic path. She found her way into Buddhism through the Open Heart Project 5 years ago, after a chance encounter with a slim library book on the basics of meditation. Sue is a knitter and a beginner weaver, and she finds fiber art rich in sensory gifts, as well as being metaphorical for her own life's journey. And just on a personal note, our paths intersected at the Open Heart Project, and we are in a meditation circle group together. And Sue's presence always makes me smile, and her thoughtful way of expressing herself warms my heart. So thank you, Sue. Thanks for being here again. I always love when people say yes to doing these kinds of things. So tell me, what does a fierce awakening mean to you, and how has it shown up in your life?
The first time I heard the phrase, honest to goodness, what popped up immediately in front of my inner eye was my mother. My mother was the very embodiment of a fierce woman. She was a single mother. She forged her own path. She ended up having a really sort of amazing career in the field of disability rights in Washington, D.C. I mean, part of a select committee of people who assisted with the ADA laws back in the day. And she has published a couple of books about it. I mean, but she was just a fierce personality. She embraced what came in front of her wholeheartedly and with tremendous energy and enthusiasm. Amazingly enough, her parents were two of the quietest people you have ever met. They were academics. They were very mild, modest people. And she was just like a streaking meteor. And I once commented to one of my bosses that my mother was like a bright shining star. And she looked at me and she said, I can see that in you. And I was really taken aback. I had never thought of myself like that. I always thought of myself as the plain little girl who sort of traveled with my mother through life. And she loved me very, very dearly. And that's one thing I have. Her passion in affections was something that is definitely part of my life too. I have 3 adult children, a second marriage of 36 years, and 2 grandchildren, another one on the way. The passion for these folks that I have is just enormous. So the kind of, like I said, my mother's face popped up. Fierce is just a word that described her. Absolutely.
Oh, but well, in that time, to be able to take a stand for disability rights in the, what was this? This was like the early 60s, I suppose,
60s
or
and 70s, yes.
yeah. And this was such, I mean, this was such an awakened part of society, like history, right? And all the things that were happening in that time frame. Is there one thing that she may have conveyed to you that people see you in her? Like, what was the one gift she gave to you?
An interesting thing, and I only reflected on this after her death when I was packing up her household goods. Um, she had a little wooden sign. It's not an original saying, but if not now, when? If not me, who? And honest to goodness, that phrase I think has been a guiding thing for me. When someone says, we need a volunteer to do such and such, it's like, well, I could do that. And I have had so many volunteer positions because of that. And they've been wonderful. I mean, in Scouts and Little League and nature center councils and nothing political, but just volunteer organizations that have ended up being gateways to knowing some delightful people. So that phrase really stuck with me.
Well, and I think it does describe how I know you too, right? It sounds in all of our conversations, you are someone who steps up and takes a lead when there's a need, right? And just reading your list of your work. I mean, what a broad range from going from marketing assistant to special education to clinical social work to preschool teacher. I mean, these are, this is not your typical career path in a lot of ways.
My bachelor's degree is in economics, which has absolutely no reflection in my personal life, except it got me my first job. Um, out and I got my degree as a 30-year-old. I had taken a hiatus and worked very hard to put my first husband through school and then having secretarial jobs. And then I had a child. And then in my 30s, regrouped, got a different sort of job. And I was actually, a job I forgot was customer service manager, which is where I met my current husband, who was a construction manager at the same company. Um, I have a facility, and I talking about your gifts is so odd, but I have a facility with putting words together precisely. Um, I wrote contracts, I evaluated contracts, negotiated with customers. That came in very handy there. I think had I followed my original path, I might have ended up being a lawyer or a teacher, something like that. But as it was, I had this passion for these little kids, and these preschoolers just fracture me. I just love them to pieces. And when I was a preschool teacher in Maryland, I really developed an affinity and um, an inquiry into how little children's minds work, how the little kids of yesterday grow into the adults of today, what effects do trauma and family circumstances and economic circumstances have on them. And that sort of propelled me into getting a master's degree in social work.
Well, let me honor you for acknowledging this, right? Going back to school at 30, after you've already started your family, I think many in our community can relate to that because I think many people have done that where there's been one path and then something else happened and you had to pivot towards that. And gravitating towards these little people and seeing how their mind works because you and I talk about this in our circle groups about the power of our minds and the thoughts and the racing thoughts and how to control them. Okay, well, what did it take to go back to school later in life?
Well, that was not my latest degree. My latest degree was when I was 52. So my master's degree was when I was 52. That took enormous grit. I had two children who were high schoolers, um, family to run, a house to run, everything else. And I just really put the shoulder to the wheel and just did it. That pivot was actually from an encounter with a long time friend who I've had intermittent contact with over the years. I had thought about going back to school and getting a master's in education and being a teacher, because at that time I was in special education. And I thought, this is wonderful. I love doing this. I love special ed. But a friend of mine said, you know what? If you're 50 years old and a teacher, you are phoning it in. You're looking at retirement. You are not working 50-hour weeks. If you're brand new as a teacher, you will work 50 to 60-hour weeks. Is that what you really want to do? And she was a clinical social worker and said, how about considering that? And I thought about it. I interviewed at the local university, and it's like, yes, I would like to do this. I would like to work with children on a clinical basis because that had been a subject of inquiry for me before. And when I graduated, I did have a position with a children's mental health agency.
I love these leaps here, right? It's like it's just the way life shows up, and I'm so glad you followed this intuition to move in this way, because how did you show up for these kids? You know, how do you show up, and what did they teach you about being fierce and awakened? Because I think kids' minds move in such a different way.
They do. And of course, when you are working with children in a mental health capacity, these are children that have had things environmentally in their family and circumstances that have been sources of trauma. So these are traumatized children. And I learned rather quickly that resilience is the key. They just need a caring adult to believe in them, to help them see that there is a future path, that their damage is not irretrievable, that there is something good in them. And honestly, connecting that dot with the Buddhist philosophy of basic goodness is a leap that I made, just not too many years ago. It's like looking back at those children, helping to believe that they have inner goodness and something of value is so amazing. I later worked in the field of suicide prevention and learned quickly something I had found in my work with children. The children as young as 7 or 8 understand what suicide is. I apologize if this is triggering for any of your listeners, but it is a very sobering thing when you think about children's response to trauma. If they have no resilience, if they have no core of goodness that they can sort of hold on to like an inner teddy bear, um, it's very dangerous. It is incredibly dangerous. Then to make another leap, this was another pivot in my life. I went to work for the United States Army as a victim advocate. A victim advocate in the military works with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And these were those children grown up. That was astonishing to me when I sat with them and they talked about their lives. These were those children, but much bigger and in uniforms.
Wow, Sue.
And it was all really hard. I mean,
No, but I think but it's such important work, uh, because I think we often don't want to talk about trauma, right? We don't, and especially with social media now, we're very inclined to post the happy photos of life, and this is causing a big concern in a population, and a large population that doesn't have that outlet or that way of expressing the joy in their life, right? So how do you bring resilience to these conversations? Because and not let it impact your joy, right? How do you engage?
that that was a struggle. That was an enormous struggle for me as a new social worker, a new clinician. I had a 40-minute drive home from my office, from my office to my home from when I worked with children. I needed every second of those 40 minutes to close the cabinet door on the little people that I've been working with all day and open my mental door to what was going on in my family. As I said, I had 2 high schoolers, one of whom was looking at colleges at the time. It's like, they're an important points in their life. I had a marriage. I still have this marriage. And, for better or for worse, that's a source of joy for me. And my children, of course, were a source of enormous joy. But there was also, even in the stories, and it's all about stories, even in the stories that these small people were talking about in my day to day, kids will find a bit of joy in anything. And if you can help them find that, they can breathe a little easier. They can talk about the goofy thing they did with their friend in school. They can talk about, this sounds very odd, But the joy that this one little girl had looking through the window of the bingo hall in a native town, Alaska native town in Western Alaska, watching her mom and dad smile and have fun because all they did was fight at home. And she would describe that as she and her brother would just like giggle and hee hee, peek through the window. And she just recalled that as a pleasant memory. Now, an adult looking at it was like, really? You have your parents fighting at home? This is a source of joy to watch them laugh? Yes, it was. They are just, the mind of a child is not a linear place necessarily. And that's great. We maybe too quickly force children into linear ways of thinking.
Well, and maybe arguably or obviously too, the adult mind is not really linear, and we keep trying to be linear in our expression of this. But well, thank you for being that person, to notice and to make these connections between the person, these little people and the adults are coming into post-war situations. I imagine this is around the time that you must have been working with people coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that, and to see the link between their childhood and their adult trauma just being replayed.
And then in another pivot, after
I,
I worked for
I was going to say, I know there's
another
probably one or
pivot,
two more that I haven't even begun to think about yet.
my next pivot was I went to work for the Veterans Administration as a clinical social worker, a clinician. And I worked I had a mental health caseload. Also, I was the military sexual trauma coordinator for the Alaska VA. And then I was a suicide prevention coordinator for the Alaska VA. Both of those are really tough things to think about and talk about. But if you don't talk about them and keep them hidden, they have much more power. If you talk about them and let people know that it's okay, you have these thoughts in your head, you have these impulses, you have these emotions. That's okay. That's a normal thing. You're not weird, you're not freaky. But if we talk about them, then they get smaller. They're not giant shuddering ghosts hovering over you every minute. They're things that we can put in front of us and look at and poke around and see how they might be affecting you.
How did you get people to tell you this? Were they willing, or did you have to use some special skills to unlock?
Most of the time, people just want to be asked. I mean, really, they just want to be asked. There's a thing there, and sometimes when they come to you, they're very prickly. Folks who have been in the military and currently are in the military can have amazing defenses, unsurprisingly, because professionally they cannot let anything show that might be a chink. But by the time they get in your office and talk about safety, many clinicians these days have their computer open or taking notes on the computer as the client is talking. I would never do that. It never had anything between me and the person. I asked them if I could write some things down because I'm old and I forget stuff, and they would say fine. And if they needed to see it afterwards, I could show them my notes. But just the one-on-one connection. When I was in my master's program, I did a whole paper on the colon between 1 to 1, the ratio 1 to 1, and the power of the colon between those two ones. And that to me has always embodied what makes you human is the relationship. It's the power of relationship. And I think that's kind of been a key for me all the way back into working with children and in my own childhood. Doesn't have to be a big relationship. That's a relationship.
But I haven't ever thought about the colon between the 1 to 1. And it does really put one person face to face with the other person. That little bit of punctuation right there does actually create a face to face, one looking at one interaction. And you wrote a thesis about that. That's really...
Yeah, I did. I wrote quite a lengthy paper, both how it is a spacer and a joiner. I mean, it was a long thing. It was a little bit on the overly academic side, but it got me an A, so I don't worry about it.
No, but it is these little like the small little things that create the interaction between people and the sacred interconnectedness we all have, right? And something just thinking about that, how we throw around these one on one to one words and we don't actually give them any meaning. We don't notice what that means anymore. So thank you for highlighting that. That feels like, especially in pandemic times right now, it feels like an important thing to notice of how we are having one-on-one interactions and who we're talking to and how we're talking about things. But
I've also learned about myself, um, and I don't know whether it can be considered a gift or just the way I am. In a large group of people, I will make a one-to-one connection with the person next to me. Rather than talking to the group at large, generally, it will be me turning to the person next to me and sharing a joke, sharing an observation. Um, this, that is more my style than um, speaking to a group. It took me enormous learning learning challenges to learn to talk in front of a large group, because part of my job when I worked for the Army and the VA was speaking in front of groups. That was a hard thing for me. I really had to find a person in the audience to speak to. That was a challenge.
and that's how you managed to do it by really just connecting with the one person. Now tell me about your dharmic path. How did you start this? And tell us what your refuge name is, by the way. I see it on
It
your.
says Shiwachozo. That means Peace Dharma Lake, which I totally love the meaning. Peace Dharma Lake. That's an awesome refuge name. Thank you, Susan Piver. When I first retired, I was trying to think of what are my goals in retirement? What do I want to do? I'd already been invited to be a part-time naturalist at the nature center near my house, because I've been volunteered there off and on for years. Wanted to do yoga, and then I'm an inveterate library haunter, and I wanted to try meditation, but I don't know what to do. Just sitting there, just kind of sitting, really, is that all it is? So I got this little tiny book, and it was by Lodro Rensler, who was one of the people involved in the formation of the Open Heart Project. And it was really how to meditate. And it was a really thin little book. And I thought, "Oh, that's why it's a thin little book, because it's really simple." So I started with that. And then, of course, as we do, we jump online and try and learn more about things. And I got involved with him and Susan Piver. And after about a year of not being part of the Open Heart Project, but accessing what was available to the general public, I thought, this really resonates. There is richness here. This is a new path, but it has so much richness and promise. It's so genuine. So I joined the Open Heart Project, and at that time we had daily Dharma gatherings, which were so amazing. These wonderful teachers that Susan Piver knew, and every day at 4 o'clock Alaska time, I could sit there and listen to, meditate for 15 minutes and listen to 15 minutes of brilliant teaching from these generous and warm people. And then have gone on to be part of more workshops and part of the circle groups of small groups of Open Heart members. And I have also accessed one of the daily free recordings by a Zen master, Sokuzan, who operates out of Battle Creek, Michigan, Sokugoji Monastery. And learning about Zen has been enormously interesting for me. It's the same and it's different. And I really have enjoyed that. I actually went, this is so amazing and stupid. In 2018, Susan Piver and Lodro Rensler offered a spring week-long retreat at Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado. And I thought, oh, I really love both of them. This is like, they're like rock stars to me. I'll go. I never meditated for more than half an hour in my life. And here was a week-long retreat, really. So I went. I sat more than I ever thought I could sit. Um, more than half the time, it was a silent retreat. We spent our days not talking, which I ended up totally loving. I'm so glad I did that. It was such an incredible stretch. The first hour, I thought I was going to jump out of my skin. I was sitting in a meditation hall with 90 people, these two teachers that I loved just and respected so much. Well, three, because Kevin Townley was one of the teachers. Um, and I thought, I just can't jump out of my skin. I just have to sit here. And I did. That was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done. I was very grateful for the shamatha technique. That really helped a lot.
Well, and the
That was
shamatha,
a huge, huge risk.
well, it is, just to boil it down, right? I mean, this is like that calm, abiding presence, just placing awareness on your breath, just showing up and doing that, and that's it. I mean, that's it. Label thoughts, thinking, and then carry on, right? And
It
it is
was,
the hardest thing, and it is the most joyful thing. I know I could do, and I know you feel similar on that. But how are you surprised that you're on this path now that meditation's such a
yes.
part of your
Yep.
life?
I was raised in a Protestant Episcopal church. I was always in choirs. I was a singer, loved the music. What's not to love about all that Bach and Beethoven? Um, you know, that was my upbringing, very mainline Protestant church, which I felt in later years after we moved in Alaska, I came to the feeling that I'm really only in this for the music because they really love the music. I mean, I've sung Messiah with so many choruses for many decades. I really love this music. But the service itself is sort of I'll cross my fingers while I say these words sort of a thing, because these are someone else's words. These are not my words. Um, they I can be with them, but not in them, if that makes any sense at all.
Hmm. Well, and I think when you can sit in the presence of a wonderful teacher who gives you just enough insight, then you have your own words. And I think that's a little bit of what I found on some of that Buddhist path too. Like in this, and it's not even that it's a religious path, it's just the spiritual awakening part, right? Of hearing something said a different way that resonates at a different stage in life. And I'm constantly surprised to hear these little nuggets, right? Or to hear my own mind say something brilliant in meditation or out of meditation. But how are you finding?
I have learned that there are certain things that I need to write down. So I keep my little notebook next to me. And when I hear one of these phrases from a teacher or from a written source, it's almost like there's a little electric shock. Like, oh, that's truth. Oh, that's truth embedded a little better than I can say it. But that's the way I could say it if I had thought of that. And that to me is, it's just that is a source of joy. That really is. And being open to those things is wonderful.
And it's something different every single day, isn't it? Some days it's like this hot boredom and you're jumping out of your chair and you can't sit still, and other days you're just sitting through it for, like you said, as more hours than you can ever imagine that you're sitting in meditation. And the joy of being quiet. I did not know how beautiful that was until you experienced that kind of thing.
Which is interesting because my husband um, loves to have the radio on. He loves background noise. He loves music, and he's very knowledgeable. I mean, he has a collection of vinyl like you would not believe. Probably 500 albums, but he collects vintage stereo equipment, so he really knows his stuff when it comes to contemporary music. Not contemporary, but contemporary music for people our age, which is an interesting thing. And he's respectful of my desire for quiet. He really is. I also walk a lot. I walk and hike a lot. I live in a beautiful place, which is an amazing opportunity to get outside and do that. Um, but we're two very different people living in one house, and we're respecting each other's needs, which are sometimes opposite.
Well, and how are you bringing this silent meditative quality into your knitting, into your weaving? How did you discover that side of you?
Years ago, a yarn shop opened. Let's see, I think it was 2008. A yarn shop opened in our community, and the woman who owned it was just great. She was terrific. She started offering classes. Friday night, there's a knitting circle. Just come, bring your knitting, enjoy for friends. And I started to come. This is while I was still employed. Um, and we still do that. Every Friday night, a group of folks gathers, mostly women, sometimes a few men, but we just sit and knit. And that's more of a social event than a hardcore knitting event. But knitting involves taking something beautiful and making something not that is not only beautiful itself, but also is useful. Then you can give it to somebody. I don't think people that receive knitted gifts or crocheted gifts, whatever the fiber art is, kind of get that. But when you're sitting there for hours, you know, really a lot of hours putting to make a sweater or a scarf or a hat or some gloves or something, you're putting yourself, your time, your labor, and this beautiful yarn that you have thought about the person you're going to give it to, thought about the color they like, the texture, the softness, what it might mean for them. And it brings it all together in a thing. Now somebody gives you a pair of mittens, like, oh, that's a nice pair of mittens, whatever. But the person has really put more into that. And you have to let go of that. I discovered early on that when you give a handmade gift, the recipient doesn't kind of always get that. Eventually they might, but they really kind of don't. And that's all right. The gift is still there. A gift is what's given. How the recipient chooses to use it, not use it, put it on the shelf, give it to the Salvation Army, whatever. That is theirs to do with. But it still remains that gift with that feelings of affection put into it.
It feels like, and especially now that we're talking in the fall, this sort of the giving and receiving and how you put this together, right? Like giving without attachment or giving with attachment, even, right? Like there is a lot of attachment to it. And then receiving it with attachment and without attachment. It's that sort of complementary opposite. Like it's not, you're doing it from the goodness of your heart. It will be received however it's received and being okay with all of that. And I think this is a cycle that I feel is part of the Fierce Awaken cycle, actually. Like I think it is learning how to not always have an expectation of something, right? And knitting seems to show you how to do something like that.
It does, and it's enormously creative. I mean, as far as color play and play with the stitches, and I've gotten to start weaving and needle felting and stuff like that. There's a hugely creative thing. My mother was an artist in the middle of all this amazing thing. She was quite a good artist. She was an excellent painter. And I never thought of myself as an artist. I was a good drafter. I could letter like a son of a gun. I got my first husband through engineering school doing all the lettering on his drawings. But I was tidy and orderly and could draw, could draw really well. I sewed a lot in my youth. But the creativity of working with beautiful colors, beautiful textures, it really is a joy. Just tactily, it's wonderful. You never use cheap yarn. Always use yarn that feels good. The colors to put together, the stitches, the patterns or non-patterns, however that works out for you. I've really enjoyed doing that and really exploring the options there.
So, what gift are you exploring now to uncover? What impulse are you following?
Unbuttoning the creativity. I've always written, kept writings of some kind, doing poetry, unbuttoning that, taking the language and shaking it up a little bit and going into metaphors that might not be so obvious. Um, being more playful with my fiber arts. Like I learned needle felting this past weekend from a friend. It's so much fun. But just getting a picture of a sunset to look the way my mind wants the sunset to look. Um, loosening things up. I have a friend who used to be a commercial artist until she had a stroke and her art has changed. And she says, play when you have whatever art form, whether it's poetry, whether it's watercolors, which I really love doing, whether it's knitting, play with it. What have you got to lose? Risk it. There's no A's, there's no one going to grade you, just play. And that to me, that was great wisdom. My friends addicted to play. I have a hard time sometimes playing. I'm a very
We,
dutiful person.
we forget, don't we? We forget. And the play is vital. It's really vital.
It
And
is. Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, like, uh, you're expressing the play in a lot of different ways right now. The poetry, the knitting, shaking up the words and finding new metaphor.
What I found also, I do hikes. One of my jobs at the nature center is doing hikes for preschoolers, which is all about play in the outside. And every preschooler, of course, comes with a grown up, but getting the grown ups involved in the play. Because when you're a mom of a preschooler, you're concerned with, do they have to go potty? Do they need to drink of water? Do they have the right boots on? Have they lost their mittens? All the little nuts and bolts of taking care of a little person. But when we're out walking and we stop to pat horsetails, when we stop to look at trees and put our finger on the bark of this tree and put our finger in the bark of that tree, when we look at the insides of dead trees, I mean, all this stuff, getting them involved with nature in a playful and yet respectful way and loving way. It's like talking about this enormous tree that's 150 years old, that's older than your grandma's grandma, and talking about the fish that come back to our river from the sea every year and how long they've traveled. Do they have a suitcase? How do they eat? Just talking about all these things. And kids can get very joyful about this. And when they're joyful, their parents tend to be joyful too. And I think we will grow environmentally conscious children when we do that.
I hope so, Sue. I hope so. And any last thoughts? Any, I don't know, two or three things you would share and advise women in our community to follow?
Well, thinking about the title, Fierce Awakened Woman, I think being open to awakening, that has always been a challenge for me. I like the predictable. I am an Enneagram type 1, which is a whole other topic, but I like to know what things are right to do and wrong to do, but loosening up the threads a little bit, being open to letting some light in, being opening to the awakenings that are there. I mean, the stimulus is there. Being open to that, I think, is just maybe not something to work towards, but something to just be aware of, that there's so much there. And I would love to be fierce. I don't think of myself as fierce, but that's kind of cool.
I think you are. And I think you followed in your mother's footsteps
I hope so.
fiercely with awakening. Like, totally. Thank you, Sue. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for being here. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.